Dr. Beckwith is going to come talk to us, focusing principally on Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man. If you can, put your hands together for Dr. Beckwith.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Up until yesterday, I didn't think I was going to be speaking here. I had surgery for detached retina about 2 weeks ago, so I'm going to rely heavily on notes, which I typically don't do. I usually like to be a little bit more spontaneous, so I'm going to, who knows, it may very well turn out that way. But I'm going to talk about The Abolition of Man, the small book that Lewis published in 1943. It's a book that has had a profound influence on my own career as a philosopher, and I think there are many insights in this book that can help us to understand a lot of contemporary issues today. The Abolition of Man is actually based on a series of lectures that Lewis gave in the actually winter of 1943, between February 24th and February 26th, as the Riddell Memorial Lectures at King's College at the University of Durham. The focus of his book is to offer a critique to those who believe that morality is subjective, largely as a result of believing that the hard sciences are the only means by which we can know anything. Because the hard sciences can provide no insights as to whether anything in nature, including human beings, and their acts are intrinsically good or evil. Good and evil cannot be in the world per se, but an imposition of our minds on the world, arising in most cases from emotion, sentiment, and feeling. Lewis opens his book, the lectures, with a discussion of a book he had received as one of those free books that we professors often get to either review or choose as textbooks, and apparently this was the case also in the 1940s. A book that he doesn't name. He calls it the Green Book, and he doesn't even mention the authors. He gives them fictitious names, Gaius and Titius. And he finds in the book an understanding of the nature of an aesthetic judgment that he thinks has implications for judgments in other areas of life that philosophers are interested in, questions about not only ethics but theology and the nature of human beings and so forth. I'm going to read here the two most important paragraphs in this regard from The Abolition of Man. He writes, in their second chapter, Gaius and Titius quote the well-known story of Coleridge at the waterfall. You remember that there were two tourists present, that one called it sublime and the other pretty, and that Coleridge mentally endorsed the first judgment and rejected the second with disgust. Gaius and Titius comment as follows. When the man said, "This is sublime," he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or shortly, I have sublime feelings. Here are a good many good questions settled in a pretty summary fashion, but the authors are not yet finished. They add, this confusion is continually present in language. As we use it, we appear to be saying something very important about something, and actually we're only saying something about our own feelings. Then Lewis goes on a couple of paragraphs later to explain why this is an important, that it may seem to be a sort of benign comment about the use of language, but it really has deeper implications about what we think about the good life and how we make judgments about human flourishing. This is what Lewis writes. The schoolboy who reads this passage in the Green Book will believe two propositions. Firstly, that all sentences containing a predicate of value are statements about the emotional state of the speaker, and secondly, that all such statements are unimportant. It is true that Gaius and Titius have said neither of these things in so many words. They have treated only one particular predicate of value, sublime, as a word descriptive of the speaker's emotions. The pupils are left to do for themselves the work of extending the same treatment to all predicates of value, and no slightest obstacle to such extension is placed in their way. The authors may or may not desire the extension, that may never have given the question 5 minutes serious thought in their lives. I'm not concerned with what they desired, but with the effect their book will certainly have on the schoolboy's mind. In the same way, they have not said that judgment of values are unimportant. Their words are that we appear to be saying something very important, when in reality we are only saying something about our own feelings. No schoolboy will be able to resist the suggestion brought to bear upon him by that word only. I do not mean, of course, that he will make any conscious inference from what he reads to a general philosophical theory that all values are subjective and trivial. The very power of Gaius and Titius depends on the fact that they are dealing with a boy. That is, and he goes on to talk about the importance of moral formation or philosophical formation, that the boy who hears this is going to take that eventually as he develops, as he's indoctrinated, as he's formed, to make judgments about other aspects of life that maybe the authors of the English prep book had not intended. His point here is this, that he wants to show that an apparently benign idea, namely the idea that Gaius and Titius are offering these prep students, has far-reaching consequences. For example, supposing today, I'm on Facebook. I don't know if any of you guys are on Facebook. Supposing somebody came up to me and said, Beckwith, how many friends do you have? And I said, 4,994. He said, no, I mean real friends, not friends on Facebook. So supposing I answered, well, what a friend is what we decide on Facebook what a friend is. Now, what I've done is I've shifted from asking the question, what is real friendship? Does it involve certain types of commitments and interaction with my neighbors, my colleagues, and so forth? Is it a real thing that I can know? Or is it something that we simply define as a consequence of some kind of agreement? In other words, I desire that my friends on Facebook really are friends, so we'll all say that we're really friends. This is the, now that's another, it may seem benign on one level, but let's take it to another question. Take a common retort that one hears when people get into heated debates about moral questions, such as, that may be true for you, but it's not true for me. Again, once one reduces the desirable to what one desires rather than what is good and what one ought to desires, all bets are off. What Lewis is saying here is that once the question is shifted from what is the nature of this thing and what is its good to the question of what is it that we desire, and should the world conform to our desires, or should our desires conform to the way the world really is, changes everything altogether. It changes the way we look at moral questions. Some of you may be familiar with an article that came out about 2 years ago in the Journal of Medical Ethics called Should the Baby Live? It was an article defending infanticide. It was authored by two Italian philosophers, Giubilini and Minerva. Great names if you're Italian. Even if you're not Italian, it's a great name. Giubilini and Minerva, they author this article, and one of the questions they have to deal with is, well, what justifies infanticide? He said, well, the reason why infanticide is justified is that the goodness of one's life is dependent on whether you have a conscious awareness of having a life plan. So instead of asking the question, which in the classical world and in many religious traditions, especially within the Christian tradition, the question is usually asked, what sort of thing is this, and what leads to its flourishing, and what sort of responsibilities do I have to that thing in order that its flourishing come to fruition? No, the question is not about the nature of the thing, but whether in fact there is an entity that has conscious experiences that it desires. So supposing that same entity desires not to live anymore, the question isn't whether life itself is an intrinsic good. The question is whether it thinks it's an intrinsic good. A couple of times in one of my classes here, or over the past couple of years in several of my classes here at Baylor, I'll ask my students why they think slavery was wrong. And typically the immediate response, and this is, I think, the influence of this sort of thinking that Lewis is warning about, immediately students say, some of them, not all of them, will say, Well, it's because the slaves didn't consent. So then I raised the question, well, what if they did consent? I mean, what if we found, let's say we discovered the writings or the testimony of ex-slaves that were sort of disappointed with the end of slavery? You know, after all, they had a roof over their head and they were fed wonderful meals and or whatever sort of claims were made. Would that change it? And all of a sudden, there's a kind of tension there. And the tension is between what? Having, on one hand, a kind of visceral belief that this is an intrinsic wrong, but on the other hand, being formed in a way to believe that we are determined the wrongness of things by whether we desire them. This is precisely, I think, what Lewis is warning about. Theological claims fall prey to this as well. Several years ago, I was delivering a lecture at Texas Tech University Law School on issues of science, theology, and the law, and there was a gentleman in the audience that raised his hand during the question and answer period, and he didn't ask a question. He said, all you've given us are religious arguments, which wasn't actually true, but that's what he said. And I said, well, I'm relieved. I thought you were going to say they were bad arguments. Now, the assumption was what? That anything sort of tightly tethered to something outside of the hard sciences really can't be an item of knowledge. Because just by simply putting an adjective in front of my argument, that was enough to sort of say, there's nothing there, move on. This is what I think Lewis is warning about in the abolition of man. Now, there's another part of his book that my colleague Ralph Wood talked about very briefly in his lecture, and that is the focus that Lewis puts on the ubiquity of the natural moral law, or what he calls the Tao. That is T-A-O. He's not talking about the stock market. What he means here is that there are certain first principles of morals and ethics that we cannot not know, as the philosopher at University of Texas, J. Budziszewski, has put it. Because they are first principles, they are not the result of a scientific experiment or confirmation of a theory. They are, to think that's the way we're to discover ethical principles is what my late friend Greg Bonson once called the beer in the refrigerator fallacy. That is, if somebody asked you to look, if there's beer, if somebody asks you is there beer in the refrigerator, you go look, right? But if somebody asks you whether it's right to torture children for fun, you don't look in the refrigerator, right? It's not an empirical question. It's a different sort of question. So in The Abolition of Man, Lewis he attempts to show the impossibility of completely rejecting the natural moral law by showing that attempts to create new values must always rely on the natural moral law itself, usually exaggerating one good at the expense of others. And secondly, he shows that the great civilizations throughout human history assumed the fundamental goods found in the natural moral law. Now, of course, my colleague Ralph doesn't think that Lewis made his case, and we can have that argument. Probably don't have enough time to do that this afternoon. In any event, given Lewis's first point that modern man claims to believe that our subjective desires are the ground of moral beliefs, there is a persistent and growing need to conquer our natures through the advancement of science in order to conform it to our desires. However, Lewis believes that even here, the Tao cannot be fully submerged. Now, here I want to bring in to the conversation two writers that I think, in fact, exemplify this problem that we find in that Lewis brings to our attention in The Abolition of Man. I probably am going to only have enough time for one of them. I may go on to the second if we have enough time. The first is Steven Pinker. Some of you know who Steven Pinker is. He's a psychologist at Harvard University. In 2009, he published an article in the New Republic called The Stupidity of Dignity. It's an article in response to the President's Commission on Bioethics, at that time chaired by the late Edmund Pellegrino, and prior to that, Leon Kass. The committee had put together a collection of essays and testimonies by different scholars across a variety of disciplines talking about the importance of human dignity in bioethics. And Pinker was one of the testifiers, and he didn't fare too well in his testimony. He was interrogated rather strongly by Gilbert Melander, Robert George, and I think Peter Lawler, and maybe Marianne Glendon. That's a tough four to have to deal with. He was not pleased with the results and believes that dignity is irrelevant to bioethics. So let me read to you a quote here from Pinker from the article, The Stupidity of Dignity. He wants to argue here that autonomy or consent does all the work that dignity, the classical view of human dignity, was used for. So you don't need, all you need is a patient's consent. You don't need any sort of abstract concepts about human flourishing or anything of that sort. This is what he says. The problem is that dignity is a squishy, subjective notion, hardly up to the heavyweight moral demands assigned to it. Ruth Macklin, another bioethicist, has argued that bioethics has done just fine with the principle of personal autonomy, the idea that all humans have the same minimum capacity to suffer, prosper, reason, and choose. No human has the right to impinge on the life, body, or freedom of another. This is why informed consent serves as the bedrock of ethical research and practice, and it clearly rules out the kinds of abuses that led to the birth of bioethics in the first place, such as Mengelé's sadistic pseudo-experiments in Nazi Germany and the withholding of treatment to indignant black patients in the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. Once you recognize the principle of autonomy, Macklin argued, dignity adds nothing. I don't think this works, and let me give you two examples of why it doesn't work. Imagine this. What if, while on a panel discussion of a meeting of the American Psychological Association, supposing you're on a panel with Professor Pinker, and you turn to him and shout, "Sit down, shut up, I am right and you are wrong, and that's that." I suspect that Pinker would find this treatment grossly inappropriate, one not consistent with the sort of respect a man of his accomplishments and stature should be afforded in such a public venue. He would indeed be correct. But why would he think so? Is there something about him that requires others to treat him with respect and deference? Perhaps it is his accomplishments. That seems partly right. But what precisely is it about his accomplishment that demand our respect? It seems to me that they are impressive because they are the consequence of the development of natural gifts that a person with such gifts is morally required to hone and perfect and not to waste on frivolity. After all, if in another possible world, Steven Pinker II, another Steven Pinker, had in fact spent his adult years as a couch potato, collecting welfare checks, eating Cheetos, and watching Jerry Springer until he died as an obese loner in a Central Texas trailer park, we would rightfully lament the incredible waste of native abilities that not only disrupted Mr. Pinker's own good, but the common good as well. So we would say that Steven Pinker II, by living a life of laziness and self-indulgence, did not properly respect himself. He would, by all accounts, have exercised his personal autonomy, and yet he did so in a way inconsistent with the intrinsic purposes of a being of his nature. So the exercise of autonomy not only cannot adequately ground human dignity, it cannot be exercised inconsistent with that dignity. Now, let me give you a second example. Let me quote again a portion of Pinker's article. Informed consent serves as the bedrock of ethical research and practice, and it clearly rules out the kinds of abuses that led to the birth of bioethics in the first place, such as Mengelé's sadistic pseudo-experiments in Nazi Germany. Unquote. Although it is true that the Nazi victims were not provided with informed consent, it does not follow that the absence of that informed consent is the reason why the Nazi research was wicked. After all, suppose we discovered that half of the Nazis' victims had come to believe Adolf Hitler's rhetoric and concluded they were in fact to blame for all that was wrong with Germany. And imagine that some of them willingly became Mengelé's guinea pigs and the remaining went to the gas chambers because of their love for the fatherland. These courses of action would be entirely voluntary, an exercise of the principle of autonomy. But yet the reason why these people were gassed was precisely the same reason why the non-voluntary victims were gassed. A bad reason to do evil does not become less of a bad reason simply because the victim voluntarily participates in his own unjustified homicide. replacing intrinsic dignity with autonomy actually diminishes the wrong, for it turns an intrinsic wrong into a conditional one. So ironically, if this analysis is correct, it is autonomy and not dignity that is not a necessary condition for our assessing the wickedness of these acts. Thus, it is the idea that human beings have intrinsic dignity that best accounts for understanding of the wrongness of the Nazi atrocities. Let me move on to one other thinker, and then I'll open the floor for some questions. And I want to give everyone an opportunity to get to Eric's talk at 1 p.m. Richard Dawkins, another popular writer, professor at Oxford, in his book, The God Delusion, which is not a very good book. It's a very entertaining book. He's an outstanding writer, and when he writes on the sciences, he's very, very good. But when he writes on philosophy, he's very, very bad. Alvin Plantinga, in his review of Dawkins' book, said that he said, I'd call this book sophomoric, but that would be an insult to sophomores. There's a portion of the book that a lot of people, I think, miss, but I think it's an insight. There's an insight into Dawkins' thinking that actually reveals something that Lewis says in The Abolition of Man. In some ways, I think shows what Lewis is saying in The Abolition of Man about the impossibility of absolutely suppressing the Tao. He tells this story in The God Delusion of a paleontologist named Kurt Wise. Some of you, I don't know if any of you have heard of Kurt Wise. I've actually met Kurt Wise, and he's just like his name. He's both Kurt and Wise. Kurt is a paleontologist who studied under the great paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard, did his undergraduate degree at the University of Chicago in geology. He left the Harvard University as he entered as a young Earth creationist. He believes that the first chapters of the book of Genesis should be interpreted literally, and that the Bible teaches the earth is less than 10,000 years old. Now, it's not a view that I hold, or many people that I know hold, and I share Dawkins' puzzlement with Wise's tenacity. But there's something strangely and delightfully non-scientific about Dawkins' lament. This is what he says about Wise. I find that terribly sad. The Kurt Wise story is just plain pathetic and contemptible. The wound to his career, his life's happiness, was self-inflicted, so unnecessary, so easy to escape. I am hostile to religion because of what it did to Kurt Wise, and if it did that to a Harvard-educated geologist, just think what it can do to others less gifted and less well-armed. This is an odd lament for someone of Dawkins' philosophical leanings, for he denies that nature, which presumably includes Kurt Wise, has within it any intrinsic purposes from which we may draw conclusions about our moral obligations to not frustrating those ends. Dawkins claims that Darwin, that's Charles Darwin, has shown us that natural teleology of any sort, including intrinsic purposes, is an illusion, and thus maintains, this is Dawkins' words, that teleology is childish. That, by the way, is just a rhetorical bluster of the worst sort, since virtually anyone who writes in this area knows that the Darwin's critique doesn't exclude all forms of teleology. It's not the only sort out there. But in order to issue his judgment, Dawkins must know something about the nature of the sort of creature Wise is, and the obligations that such a creature has to his natural powers and their proper function. But since Dawkins cannot discover the human being's intrinsic purposes or our obligations to them by the methods and means of the natural sciences, he opines, when he is not lamenting about another person's life choices, that these purposes and obligations must be illusory and to believe them childish. Yet Dawkins' brief against Wise depends on these childish illusions. That is, to say that somehow Kurt Wise failed to live up to the expectations that we all have given his natural abilities and given the sort of creature that he is, seems to have to buy into the very notions that Lewis talks about in The Abolition of Man, namely what is the nature of a human being and what leads to a human being's flourishing, rather than asking the question, what is it, what does that person desire? I mean, I suppose if Kurt Wise said, look, I desire this life, on what grounds, the only grounds on which that Dawkins could critique him would be what? To say, well, no, you're actually treating yourself in an inappropriate fashion. That seems to buy into something that Dawkins in another context rejects. So it seems to me that the key to escaping the counterintuitive dead ends found in both Pinker and Dawkins is to abandon the failed project that the methods of the natural sciences are the model of rationality for our human endeavors and that morality is merely subjective. This is precisely the suggestion that Lewis makes in The Abolition of Man. For the innovators, as he calls them, as I noted in my comments about Pinker and Dawkins, must at some point plumb from the morality they claim to be debunking. They have to withdraw capital from the cultural inheritance, from their cultural inheritance to purchase their skepticism. And I'll conclude with these words of Lewis. Quote, all the practical principles behind the innovator's case for posterity or society or the species are there from time immemorial in the Tao. But they are nowhere else, unless you accept these without question as being to the world of action what axioms are to the world of theory. You can have no practical principles, whatever. You cannot reach them as conclusions. They are premises. Thank you. Sure, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so we've got time for a couple of questions before I want to give you a little bit of a break to use the restroom and such before Dr. Wielenberg's talk. He is our out-of-town guest, and so I hope you will stick around for his talk, Divine Lies, Divine Deception. So let's take a few questions for Dr. Beckwith. That was such a great example of moral theory in action. That was a mini tour de force. Okay, questions for Dr. Beckwith. Yes, Emily? So the question seems to be, in one of the examples of people, or in most of the examples, maybe people are giving consent, but it's not informed consent due to the circumstances at hand.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in one sense that's right. I mean, obviously, you know, the German understanding of history during the Nazi regime was mistaken, right? There's no doubt about that. But, I mean, the purpose of using the illustration is to actually tie it to Pinker's own illustration of Mengelé's experiments. I could change it. I could change it, let's say, to somebody who, in fact, let's say, holds to, well, like the case of the Pinker, the Steven Pinker II. That is the individual who just thinks this is the way to achieve the good life. So, I mean, the point, you're right. On one level, yeah, the person could say, yeah, there wasn't informed consent. But, I mean, I suppose you can easily imagine somebody even having informed, let's say, in certain situations, having fully informed consent, but like not being able to think of any other, let's suppose they say, you know what, there's really no life outside of this and I may as well just, you know, die, you know. So there's a way in which I think you could, you know, tinker with the counterexample. But at the end of the day, if let's go back to Steven Pinker II illustration. If you use that, you have to say something like, well, this kind of life is not fit for a human being, right? Well, then I think ultimately then you have to get back to the Tao again. But yeah, the Nazi one, I don't think is as good as an example as the first one. But go ahead. Yeah,
Just remember to record it.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
It's okay. We have time for one more question for Dr. Beckwith. Yes, right in the middle.
Talk a little more about your comment. I'm not sure what you meant by it, whether you believe it or not. That if you desire something, it's right or maybe wrong.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's right. The question is, asked me to repeat or to clarify, I guess, what I'd said about the idea that if you desire, that it's human desire that determines what's right or wrong. Yeah, there are philosophers and mostly, I guess, popular writers who will say something like this, that there is no universal understanding of the good life. So the whole sort of traditional project of trying to figure out what in fact are fundamental goods for human life is a failure. And so the best we can do is allow people to do whatever they want consistent with their own vision of the good life and their own desires. And in terms of the communities we live in, there's just a sort of minimal threshold, a kind of libertine understanding of existence. Now, now tying it into the example that I used from the Jubilini Minerva article, in that case, the authors, and I wrote a critique of this. If you're interested, in the issue, the published issue that came out in which their article, it originally appeared online and then appeared published, my response, in my response, one of the points that I make is that, because they say you can't harm a being unless you're obstructing or ending its life in terms of if it has a life plan. And what I argue is that that's actually probably not true for several reasons. One, we can envision cases, and this is an example I use. Imagine if a group of scientists figured out a way to intentionally stop the development of the brain so that we intentionally create anencephalic children and we harvest their organs. Someone like Jubilini and Minerva would say, well, that's perfectly okay because they don't have a life plan. But supposing, though, that a group of pro-life radicals break into the laboratory, steal the embryos, and then fix them, have they done justice? Have the fetuses been restored to health? And if you say yes, then it seems to me that you can both harm and help beings that don't have a sort of life plan. So I'm kind of relying on an intuition that people have that really that's not the whole story. You know, you could bite the bullet, I mean, on any of these things, but that's, so if you want to read my response, you can, I think you have to need a subscription unless you're a professor, but,
I'm sure we can
so,
get you a copy.
but, yeah, so, thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Becker.